Thank you very much, Joshua. Thank you very much for inviting me to chair this very interesting session. And thank you all for coming bright and early for this, what I think is promising to be a very, very interesting and exciting conference and very exciting discussion, definitely, this morning. So my name is Angeliki Kerasidou. I'm an associate professor in bioethics at the Ethos Centre here in Oxford. And I used to be actually a student. I did my master's and my DPhil student here at Harris Manchester. So it's actually quite lovely to be back in my old college. So how the morning is going to go, we have two papers. Each paper will be half an hour, so we have two presenters, and I will introduce them in turn as they come to speak. And then after the two presenters, which each paper, as I said, will be half an hour, we're going to have a 10-minute response, and then we'll have 20 minutes for discussion. So I expect all of you to be making notes and writing questions down as the speakers speak, and be ready to put your hands up at the end. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today is David Albert Jones, Director of the Anscombe Bioethics Centre here in Oxford since 2010, and Research Fellow in Bioethics at Blackfriars Hall. He's also Professor of Bioethics at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. So, David, over to you.
Thank you. And also, well, I'm sure lots of people here have many hats. And also, I'm Vice Chair for the Ministry of Defence Research Ethics Committee. And I mention that because it is actually relevant to my first slide. This paper started Life, if they have Life papers, as a prospective journal article. But I never got round to revising it in the light of reviewer comments, and then this conference turned up, and it fitted exactly to this conference, so it's been redirected. But there's much more material that I wanted to talk about, that I'm still interested to talk about, than could fit in half an hour, and so that will wait for the book, which I hope will come out. We had a conversation about hope yesterday. This is the kind of thing that we hope for, which is a temporal thing, but a reasonable amount of the arduous good, and also an arduous good which one works on together with a shared understanding of the good and a contribution one hopes to the common good. So the title of the talk in the abstracts is COVID-19 and the Undoing of Character, Moral Injury, Moral Distress, and Violations of Conscience During a Pandemic. I'm going to talk more about the subtitle and the title, and essentially I'm going to look at just three concepts: the concept of moral injury, the concept of moral distress, and the concept of conscience, and how they might relate to one another. But I'm doing so in a context of the pandemic. So the teasing out of the application to the pandemic is something for later, in a way. Let's see. Right, so I'm starting with, this is an editorial from 2020 in a journal called Occupational Medicine. By Williamson, Murphy, and Greenberg, who are three members of the King's Centre for Military Medicine. So this is relevant. That's King's College London. So King's College London have a centre which specialises in military medicine in relation to the military, and they wrote this in this editorial, which was called COVID-19 and the experiences of moral injury in frontline key workers, and they say, quote, "Much of the research in moral injury at this stage has been carried out on military personnel and veterans." That statement says much more about the authors than it does about the type, but nevertheless, that's where they start, 2020. "Much of the research into moral injury at this stage has been carried out on military personnel and veterans. However, several potential risk factors for moral injury have been identified that may be applicable to other professions during the Covid-19 pandemic. So they take a concept which for them is a concept within military medicine, that's their speciality, and they say, actually the pandemic, like other catastrophes, has some things in common with warfare, and some of the things that we see in relation to warfare might also be there. And the examples they give are the requirement of healthcare staff to self-quarantine when colleagues are being overwhelmed. So just at the time when resources are most stretched and you see your colleagues, going under, and you really want to help, you have to self-quarantine because those are the rules. But it's very frustrating. The withholding of potentially beneficial life-saving treatment due to limited equipment. So rationing, which is a ubiquitous part of healthcare, but has a particular hard edge in emergency situations, and the difficulty of performing duties adequately due to constraints of personal protective equipment. I'm not really convinced that any of these are good examples of moral injury, but these are the examples that they give, and the last one I will come back to in a slightly different form. So where does this tradition that they situate, that Greenberg and co. situate themselves in, begin? Well, it begins really before the First World War, but particularly after the First World War, reflecting on shell shock and the psychological harm done to soldiers from shell shock was. It made people more interested in trauma generally, and this developed into the concept of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder. I was surprised to find that PTSD only found its way into the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, which is the kind of Bible of psychiatry in the United States, but there's nothing quite like it in any other country, so psychiatrists all over the world look to the DSM. It was only in the third edition of the DSM in 1987 that PTSD got in, which surprises me, but there you go. But it's there in the DSM, and PTSD is defined in part because of its cause. PTSD doesn't reflect a weakness that an individual has in coping with stressful situations. It reflects an ordinary person that has been exposed to extreme and catastrophic stresses, which has had a certain impact. So you understand it not by the predisposition of the person, but by by what they have been exposed to. Hence the trauma for PTSD, and it's a well-recognised syndrome. So now to moral injury. So in the 1990s, PTSD was well recognised, well understood by psychiatrists working with veterans. But there's a psychiatrist called Jonathan Shea, and he thought there was something which was missing from the definition. In that it abstracted from making any moral judgments about what had happened, either about the causes or the effects of the problem that people had. Whereas he thought in at least some cases, the morals was what it was about, and in particular in relation to betrayal. So he was very interested in betrayal by leadership, because he thought that what a PTSD in relation to the military missed was that war is essentially a moral endeavour. That is to say, it is it's characterised by commitments to certain goods which give the rationale for the whole project. And when those goods are undermined somehow, then you have effects which are due to the nature of warfare and the nature of soldiering. And so it's one thing for people to see their their comrades killed and to be exposed to very traumatic situations. But if they think they shouldn't be there, and they think that they're doing more harm than good, and that they've been put in danger because of decisions which are either thoughtless or vicious, that they have been undermined by their military leaders and behind that their political leaders, then the ability to process or make sense of this experience, but also not only experience, these actions of theirs, is itself undermined. And therefore you get an undermining of character, hence this notion of the undoing of character. So he wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, Combat, Trauma and the Undoing of Character. And then a few years later, Odysseus in America, Combat, Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. And in both cases, he looked to Greek literature, to Homer, to see archetypes of moral action and the way in which people, the way in which there's a particular line that he picks up due to the actions of their leaders, the people have been destroyed, and by the people being destroyed, he means that that as a nation, as a people, that their sense of themselves has been destroyed. That this is a moral undoing. So he thought that, and he gave a definition of moral injury. His definition of moral injury was betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. So that was his definition. So it has to be in a high-stakes situation, life-and-death type situation, but it's essentially betrayal by someone with legitimate authority. If they don't have legitimate authority, it's not about the enemies and it's not like random people. It's about the chain of command and the rationale of being part of this endeavor together being undermined by actions of one's superiors. And he also thought that, in his view, because this was his sort of his understanding of it, that the solution to this, or the way to address this, was to address military leadership. So he was very interested in education, about expertise, ethical formation, and support for leadership in the armed forces. That was something that he had a particular interest in. But very soon after Shea put this forward, a lot of people said, well, it's true that you can be undermined by what other people do, but you can also be undermined by what you do yourself. And it's sometimes the actions that people have done that haunt them, and that can have this same undoing of character. And so Brett Litz and others put forward a different definition of what they called potentially morally injurious experiences, PMIE. So this comes into the literature then. These potentially morally injurious experiences amount to perpetuating or failing to prevent or bearing witness to or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So they're thinking both of things that you hear about afterwards, but also things that you might yourself perpetuate. There are good things and bad things in this definition. The bad, which I'll come on to because it relates to the concept of moral distress, is that what for Shea is an action, essentially, has become an experience. So you have these potential experiences, and experiences are things that happen to you rather than things that you do, whereas it's essential to Shea's understanding of moral injury, and to what I think is helpful in the concept of moral injury, that it is about action. It's not about what you suffer or experience. It's about what you do or what others do to you. So I think that's problematic, but it is useful to extend it. And Shea says he acknowledges this, and he also says sometimes both happen, and perhaps it's more common that both happen. So as a result of, as it were, the betrayal from above, you then do something which you then also regret. So he gives examples of being ordered to leave your wounded buddy behind. So you have an order, but then you obey the order, and then you become complicit, and it haunts you both that you did it, but also you were put in that situation by the chain of command. Another example he gives is of your superior sexually exploiting somebody who's your subordinate, and you not intervening to stop it. Where again, there's a chain of command that's difficult to push against, and is undermining or corroding people's attitudes, but there's also the complicity of the person. So there's two things happening. There's one happening, which is the leader or the institution, and the other is the individual. And Shay says, yes, both things can happen, and I think that's a good insight. So moral injury, it starts with war, and it starts with the Vietnam War, and that's not an accident. No, it is because of thinking about things that should not have been done like this, and also about what are the lasting, enduring implications for people who went through that, through hundreds of thousands of people who went through that. That's platoon, of course. So that's moral injury done. Moral distress, the language of moral distress, the interesting thing about Greenberg and co. is that they said, oh, people only started talking about moral injury from the military, when in fact, at least 10 years previously, there's been quite a broad literature about moral distress, not in the military context, but in the context of nursing ethics. And within this, because of Locus Classicus, is a book by Andrew Jameson called Nursing Practice, the Ethical Issues, 1984, a couple of years after Gilligan's With a Different Voice. And it's significant that it's about, so nursing ethics emerges soon after the change in medical ethics, the revival of biomedical ethics in the 1970s. You then have nursing ethics and the notion that there might be something which is distinctive about nursing ethics because of the distinctive role of the nurse in terms of having more personal engagement, but also typically being more junior in the healthcare team. And it's that combination of the emotional, the greater emotional strain of the work, but also the more likely to be placed in a difficult situation where you know more about the medicine than the relatives, and you know more about the patient humanly than the doctor. But the doctor has medical authority, and the relatives have the kind of the human authority, and the nurse is in between. And is often sitting, watching things, but has to actually deliver on some of the things which these two groups have decided sometimes badly. So it was that particular kind of context that Jameson was interested in. So I'm going back to the Greenberg. I say Greenberg because I know Neil Greenberg and I don't know the other two, but the definition. Their definition of moral injury, interestingly, was the profound psychological distress which results from actions or lack of them which violate one's moral or ethical code. So they have already translated injury into distress, which I think is interesting, and I think they're quite different concepts myself. But Jameson, in his definition of distress, said, "It is when one nurse knows the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action." So several interesting things about this. It's about a nurse. I mean, that's not surprising. The book's called Nursing Ethics. It's clues in the title. But it is about a particular role. So this is not just general ethics for everybody. This is about a particular kind of role and the ethics which emerge from these roles. And similar, I think, with the military context, that moral injury goes from the military to medicine because medics are involved with the military. And military are also involved in emergencies, in Ebola and in catastrophes and so on. And so the language which is being used with veterans starts also to be used for doctors who are in the military context or the emergency context. That's how it filters that way. But it also filters from nursing ethics to medical ethics. Right. Oh, that's just Florence Nightingale. What? I'll go back to Florence. Moral distress, I think, very interesting concept, and has some of the same elements about moral commitment and the tensions of it, but because it focuses on distress, and distress is a psychological state, then it attracts one way of an analysis, which is to think about it in social scientific terms, and to look for example, instruments by which you might measure the frequency, intensity, and so on of moral distress. This is also in part because of, I might say, the sociology of nursing ethics, which might be more broadly part of the sociology of the professionalization of nursing, and nurses looking for professional qualifications, and that discipline looking to the social sciences as a way of getting status, I think. But it is characteristic that nursing ethics has far more empirical ethics than medical ethics does, if you just analyse there. And this is, I think, because of a wishing to borrow the higher status of certain other disciplines, or the perceived higher status. So then moral distress becomes something that you measure, but then this takes it in the opposite direction to Jonathan Shea, because Shea wanted to take something which started as in the empirical, and say, no, it's properly moral. You need to understand what's going on morally. Whereas by seeking to measure how intense people's feelings of discomfort are in various sort of situations, they've actually moved in the opposite direction from thinking, were those feelings appropriate or not? Was something bad going on? What was the justice of the situation? To how often does it happen, and who does it happen on? Are religious people more susceptible to it, and that kind of thing? As though we could understand it without understanding its moral cause and its moral effect, which is a mistake. And then, so I'm aware of time, and as so often, Augustine has thought of all of this before we have. And at one point in the it's a City of God, book 15, he says, "Let everyone then who thinks with pain on all these great evils, so horrible, ruthless, acknowledge that this is misery." So that this is about thinking about, and the ruthless evils he's talking about are warfare. So he's just said that war can sometimes be justified, but then says, even when it's justified, there's so much horror in war that who can contemplate it without even the contemplating of it involving suffering? And this is about hope and whether we have a fulfillment in this life, or we have a fulfillment outside this life. But so he says, and if anyone either endures them or thinks them without mental pain, so without moral distress, we might say, this is the more terrible plight still, for he thinks himself happy because he has lost human feeling. So there's a question of moral distress as exemplifying human reaction to an objective distress, objectively distressing thing. And if we think that the problem is distress and we should alleviate it, then there's a possible problem is that we actually remove something which is the properly human reaction to such things. That we should be distressed. Something should distress us. And if we're not distressed, there's something wrong. Yes. So moral distress as a concept has a different lineage to moral injury as a concept, but it has some overlaps, and it is in some ways quite interesting, and it's particularly related to nursing ethics. Conscience. Conscience and conscientious objection. Conscience is a much older word, used by so many people that it's used in many ways, and it's not always a very helpful word in that respect, but particularly by the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, which is quite a central condition of thinking about it. Conscience essentially is an act of thought. It's making a judgment about what to do or about what you have done, and it's nothing more than that. So, but conscience, the question of conscience is interesting when you think about human psychology, but also conscience comes to be, because conscience is essentially about, conscience is, conscience, according to Thomas Aquinas, is nothing else than the application of knowledge to some action. He said, that's all it is. It's just the application of knowledge. It's just thought. Or as Hannah Arendt said, conscience is a byproduct of the liberating effect of thinking. And there's nothing which is mysterious about us giving our own thoughts a particular kind of status. As Wittgenstein says, no one can think a thought for me in the way no one can don my hat for me. If I'm thinking, then it has to be me that's thinking. Somebody else can't think for me. Either there's no thinking, or I have to think for myself. Nobody else can think for me. So conscience then becomes a way of talking about freedom to think, and therefore about freedom. And then subsequently, it becomes a way to talk about accommodating minority views of people who think differently. And in particular, conscientious objection I think is a particular mechanism by which the majority accommodate a minority view in terms of a mandate. So usually something will be mandated by the majority, but in a certain they say we won't mandate it because of a different view from this particular constituency. And understood that way, I think conscientious objection is a particular mechanism in society. Also, it's a truth, or it's a phenomenon about society. It's different from the individual. If there's no conscientious objection allowed for something, it's still the case that people should follow their conscience. It's just that they won't get any help from society. So you would hope in a liberal society that you would get help to be able to think, because thoughtlessness is not something to encourage in society. But there might be limits to how much you're allowed to think for yourself, and therefore you might have to take those limits sometime. Anyway, and I'm almost over. So conscientious objection as a thought, as a mechanism in this way, it starts in relation to Quakers and other nonconformists who object to military service, but then it's also invoked in relation to taking oaths, and then also to the imposition of religious education in the mid-19th century, and then to vaccination in the Vaccine Act of 1893, which specifically talks about conscientious objection in relation to parents. And then military service in 1916 in relation to conscription. But it is always but it's useful that we circle back to war. And why might this be relevant to the pandemic? Because of the language of the war against the virus. So you have, we used to have these regular briefings, and the briefings, they're just like wartime briefings. This is about COVID, but if this was in Ukraine, it would be about the war, exactly the same setup. You have and those kind of announcements, because you're facing a national emergency, but also because some of the stresses are similar to warfare, in that also the person who's doing it might also be under threat themselves. Their own health might be at threat, which is not generally the case for doctors in ordinary medicine, but it is in the time of a pandemic. And in that way, doctors become like soldiers. So I will stop at that point. Thank you very much.